The first time I noticed the footprints outside my window, I thought little of it. Out here in the countryside, in a home set back from the road and ringed with trees, it wasn't unusual to find signs of animals prowling through the night. Deer, raccoons, stray dogs, each left their imprints in the soft soil after a night of foraging. So when I pulled back the curtains that morning and saw the dark, damp outlines in the earth beneath my bedroom window, I assumed it was just that. A creature searching for food, brushing up against the house in its curiosity. But these weren't paw prints. They were shaped unmistakably like feet. Human feet, barefoot. I crouched down to inspect them more closely, pressing my hand against the cold pane of glass as I peered out. The dirt was still wet from last night's rain, and the prints looked fresh. 10 toes, an arch, a heel. Whoever had stood there had lingered long enough for the ground to record them deeply, as if they hadn't just passed by, they had stopped. Stopped and stood there, looking in. I remember laughing nervously to myself, trying to brush it off. Maybe it had been one of the neighbor's kids, playing some cruel prank. Maybe someone walking home from the pub had cut across the field, their shoes soaked, and decided for some reason to peel them off and pad barefoot past my house. Strange, yes, but not impossible. Still, the thought unsettled me. I lived alone. My husband, David, had died 2 years ago in a car accident, and since then I'd grown accustomed to the silence of the house, to the way the walls echoed differently without his presence. The thought that someone might have been standing outside, watching me as I slept, made the silence suddenly feel less safe. It felt like a weakness, an opening. That night, I drew the curtains tighter, but I couldn't resist glancing out again before bed. The garden was dark, the trees stirring faintly in the wind. Nothing moved. I told myself I was imagining things. But the next morning, the footprints were there again. At first, they looked like the same ones as before, but when I compared them, I realized they were not identical. They were new, slightly shifted to the right. Whoever it was had stood there again. They were coming back. A cold wave passed over me as I crouched at the window, studying the earth. 2 nights in a row. This wasn't a random passerby. Someone was choosing to stop here, to stand here, to watch me. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That there were footprints in the mud outside my window? That someone might be watching me at night? They would drive out, glance at the dirt, maybe take a statement and leave, and then I'd be alone again, waiting. So I decided to stay awake that night, just to see. I made tea, settled in my armchair with a blanket, and waited. The hours passed slowly. The tick of the clock grew louder, the creaks of the house seemed sharper. By midnight, I was fighting to keep my eyes open. The warmth of the blanket, the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the next room, they conspired against me. I must have dozed off. When I woke, it was to a sound. Tap. Soft, deliberate, tap. My heart hammered in my chest. I sat perfectly still, ears straining. It came again. Tap. Tap. Against glass. The window. My window. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me as I crept toward the bedroom. The tapping grew slower, almost teasing, like fingers trailing across the glass. With a shaking hand, I pulled back the curtain just an inch, enough to see out. Nothing. Just darkness. The yard was empty. But when I looked down, I saw them. The footprints. Fresh, wet, pressed deep into the soil. And as I watched, I could have sworn I saw the last droplet of water slide down the pane, as if someone had only just pulled their hand away. The next day, I told myself I had imagined it. I was overtired, still grieving, letting my mind play tricks. But when I checked the ground outside, the footprints were there again. And this time, I noticed something else. They weren't just facing the window. They were angled slightly, as if the person had pressed their face against the glass. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sit up waiting again. I locked the doors, shut the curtains, and climbed into bed with the covers pulled high. I told myself I wouldn't look. Whatever happened outside, I wouldn't look. And yet, sometime around 2 a.m., I heard it. Tap. I squeezed my eyes shut. Tap, tap. The sound was right beside me, inches from where I lay. The window, shuddering faintly with each touch. Couldn't help it. I opened my eyes, turned my head. Through the slit in the curtain, I saw him. A face, pale, pressed against the glass, eyes wide and staring in. His lips moved slowly, soundlessly, as if whispering something only I could hear. His skin was slick with rain, his hair matted to his forehead. And in that terrible, frozen instant, I recognized him. David. My husband, dead 2 years, buried beneath cold earth, and standing outside my window. I screamed. I don't even remember throwing the curtain shut, or tumbling out of bed, or locking myself in the bathroom with my phone clutched in my hands. I only remember calling the police, my voice breaking as I begged them to come. When they arrived, of course, there was no one there. The yard was empty. The only thing they found were the footprints, already softening in the rain. The officers exchanged glances, their faces polite but skeptical. They suggested I stay with family, or that I consider counseling. They left, their taillights vanishing into the trees, and I was alone again. Alone in the house where my dead husband had stood at the window. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it hadn't been real. Grief does strange things to the mind. It makes you see faces in the dark, hear voices in the silence. I told myself that's all it was. My mind, desperate to bring David back. But the visits didn't stop. Every night, the tapping returned. Sometimes gentle, sometimes insistent. Sometimes it sounded like fingernails dragging slowly across the glass. And always, when I looked, the face was there, his face. Pale, unblinking, lips moving in words I could not hear. I began to unravel. I slept in fits, ate little, jumped at every sound. Friends stopped visiting. My mother begged me to leave the house, but I couldn't. Something rooted me here, some terrible fascination. I needed to know what he wanted. One night, I gathered the courage to set up a camera. I placed it on the sill, angled toward the garden, its red light blinking faintly in the dark. I left it running and crawled into bed, heart pounding as I waited. The tapping came as it always did. I forced myself not to look, not to scream. Just let the camera see. In the morning, I played back the footage. At first, nothing. Just the yard, empty and dark. Then, at 1:57 a.m., movement. A shape emerged from the shadows. David. He stepped barefoot across the grass, his body pale in the moonlight. He stopped before the window, tilted his head, and pressed his face to the glass. His lips moved, forming words over and over. His hand lifted, fingers trailing against the pane in slow, deliberate strokes. And then he looked directly into the camera. His lips formed a single word. Over and over. Let me in. I stopped the video, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the laptop. My breath came shallow, my skin clammy. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't grief. It was real. He was real. And he wanted inside. Story 2. The car in the driveway. The night began like any other. Emma, a college junior, had just pulled into her driveway after a grueling evening shift at the campus cafe. The clock on her dashboard glowed 12:41 a.m., and she felt the familiar exhaustion of late nights stack against her bones. She killed the engine, the silence settling like a blanket around her, until the stillness became almost oppressive. The suburban street was empty, the kind of sleepy quiet you could only find in a small town. But as Emma gathered her things, her eyes caught something in the rearview mirror that made her pause. There, across the street, sat a car with its headlights off. At first, she thought little of it. People parked on the street all the time. Maybe it belonged to a neighbor. Maybe someone had friends visiting late. She tried to brush it off, telling herself she was overtired and reading into it. But as she stepped out of her car and turned to glance casually over her shoulder, something felt wrong. The car wasn't familiar. It wasn't a neighbor's sedan, not the old blue hatchback she'd seen before, nor the red pickup truck that usually lined the curb. This one was dark, an older model, black or maybe dark gray, boxy in shape, its windows tinted to near pitch. And it wasn't parked in front of anyone's house. It was just sitting there, waiting. Emma's skin prickled, but she forced herself to unlock her front door and step inside. Once the locks clicked behind her, she pressed her forehead against the wood for a moment and exhaled. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and she hated that her mind immediately drifted back to that car. She hurried upstairs, changed into her pajamas, and tried to convince herself she was just being paranoid. But when she passed by her bedroom window, curiosity got the better of her. She peeked through the blinds. Her stomach dropped. The car was closer now. It had shifted up the street, not directly in front of her house, but maybe 4 or 5 houses down, just enough to be noticeable. The hairs rose on the back of her neck, and she immediately pulled the blinds shut. Her heart pounded as she reached for her phone. She dialed her best friend, Leah, but it went to voicemail. With shaking fingers, she called the police non-emergency line, feeling ridiculous even as the words tumbled out of her mouth. "Hi, I don't want to sound crazy, but there's this car outside my house that's been moving closer every time I look." The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost routine. They said they'd send a patrol car to check it out. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, phone clutched tight, blinds drawn shut. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside felt amplified. She thought about turning on the TV for background noise, but the idea of sound breaking the silence somehow seemed worse. She waited. Finally, she saw the flash of red and blue lights through the cracks in her blinds. The police checked the street. They circled twice. Then one of them knocked on her door. "There's no car," the officer said, his tone matter-of-fact but faintly irritated, as if she'd wasted their time. "No, I swear it was right there," Emma insisted, her voice shaky. "Ma'am, the street's clear. Probably just someone passing through. You should try to get some rest." And with that, they left. Emma locked the door again, this time checking the deadbolt twice. She wanted to believe the officer, that the car had just moved on, that it was nothing. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Something had been watching her. She tried to sleep, curling under her blankets with the weight of exhaustion pressing her down, but her body refused to relax. Every sound outside made her ears twitch. At some point, she drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. That was when her phone buzzed. The sharp vibration jolted her awake. She grabbed it off her nightstand, her heart sinking when she saw the notification. Motion detected, front door, her smart doorbell camera. Hands trembling, she opened the live feed. The image flickered, grainy in the low light, but the view of her driveway came into focus. It was empty. No car. No movement. Nothing but the outline of her porch, the pale square of concrete lit faintly by the street lamp. But then her breath caught. At the very edge of the porch, just where the shadow swallowed the light, a figure stood perfectly still. It wasn't a trick of the lens. It wasn't motion blur. It was a man-shaped silhouette, tall and thin, his face swallowed in darkness, but his head tilted upward at an unmistakable angle. He was looking directly at her bedroom window. Emma dropped the phone as if it had burned her. It clattered onto the bed, but the feed still glowed on the screen. For several moments she couldn't breathe. Her body was frozen, locked between the urge to scream and the primal command to stay silent. Finally, with shaking fingers, she grabbed the phone again. The figure hadn't moved. It was as if he were carved from shadow itself, rooted to the spot, waiting. Emma wanted to call the police again, but dread slithered through her veins. What if they came and found nothing again? What if she sounded hysterical? Worse, what if they did see him, but he slipped away before they could catch him? Her eyes flicked back to the feed, desperate. The figure was gone. Not walking away. Not fading. Just gone. She jumped back from the screen as though it had lunged at her. She stumbled toward the wall, pressing her back to the plaster as if the house itself could protect her. The silence pressed in again, heavier than before. She stayed like that for nearly an hour, watching the feed until her eyelids ached from not blinking. Nothing else appeared. By dawn, the figure felt like a dream. But the next night, the car was back. This time, it was parked directly in front of her driveway. Emma didn't call the police. She didn't call Leah. She didn't do anything except sit at her window in the dark, blinds cracked open just enough to stare down at that unmoving car. Her phone buzzed again around 2:17 a.m., the same motion notification. And again, the feed showed her driveway. Again, the figure was there. But tonight, he wasn't on the edge of the porch. He was standing closer to the door, closer to her. The shadow tilted its head up at her window, and though the camera was too grainy to show details, Emma swore she saw a smile flicker where its face should be. She dropped the blinds. She pressed her hands against her ears. She whispered prayers, curses, anything to drown it out. And then the doorbell rang. A single sharp chime that echoed through the empty house like a death knell. Emma never remembered deciding to move, but suddenly she was on the floor, crawling toward her phone, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She opened the feed again with trembling hands. The figure was gone. The porch was empty. But the doorbell had rung. For the next week, the pattern repeated. Some nights, the car. Some nights, the figure. Always closer. Always watching. Never caught. Emma barely slept, her body hollowing out from fear and exhaustion. On the final night, the feed flickered to life on its own, without a notification, without her touching the phone. The screen lit up by her bed, pulling her from the thin veil of sleep. The feed showed her bedroom. From the inside. And in the bottom corner of the frame, a shadow leaned just out of view, as if something was holding the camera. Emma screamed. But no sound came out. And in the still silence of that suburban house, she realized the truth. The car wasn't watching from outside. The figure wasn't standing on her porch. They had always been inside. Watching. The knocking at midnight, the cabin was meant to be an escape. A week away from the constant buzz of city life, from the grating rhythm of car horns, endless work emails, and the overwhelming press of strangers brushing past him on every street corner. Daniel had booked it on a whim, clicking through a vacation rental site one late night when he couldn't sleep. The pictures had promised quiet. A rustic wooden cabin tucked between towering pines, its porch sagging with charm, a lake a short walk away, and not another soul in sight for miles. It had felt like exactly what he needed. The first day was everything he hoped for. He stocked the fridge with groceries from a small-town market on the way up, unpacked slowly, poured himself a drink, and sat out on the porch watching the sun bleed behind the trees. The silence felt alien at first, so complete it almost rang in his ears. He wasn't used to silence. He wasn't used to nights without sirens or muffled arguments or the television humming in a neighbor's apartment. But the stillness settled on him, heavy and comforting. He fell asleep early that night, wrapped in thick cabin quilts, the fire in the stone hearth crackling low. It was at midnight that he first heard it. Knock. 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 3 slow, deliberate raps at the front door. Daniel's eyes flew open. The room was drenched in shadows, the dying fire giving only the faintest glow. He sat up in bed, every sense taut. The sound had been unmistakable. Someone was knocking on the door. For a moment, he told himself it must have been the wind, or an animal shifting against the porch. But no, it had been too precise, too human. He waited, heart pounding, silence stretched, thick and unbroken. After what felt like an eternity, he swung his legs out of bed, pulling a hoodie around his shoulders. He grabbed the heavy flashlight from the nightstand and padded to the door. The knocking didn't return. When he opened the door, the porch was empty. The pines stood black and still under the swollen moon. Not a branch stirred. Unease rippled through him, but he told himself it was nothing. Probably just his imagination, nerves amplified by the isolation. He locked the door, returned to bed, and eventually drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. The second night, the knocking came again. Knock. 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 Always 3. Always at midnight. This time Daniel sat up immediately, heart hammering. He stared at the door, half expecting the wood to rattle from the force. But the knocks had been soft, measured, deliberate, as though whoever was out there wanted him to know they could be louder if they wished. He stood, forcing himself forward. At the door, he peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just the silver smear of moonlight on the porch planks. He threw the door open suddenly, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. But this time the silence felt wrong. Too heavy. Too expectant. He closed the door slowly, forcing a laugh. Probably just some local kids messing around, he muttered, though his voice sounded too loud in the empty cabin. But deep down he didn't believe that. By the third night, Daniel was waiting. He sat up in bed as the clock ticked closer to 12. The silence of the woods pressed against the cabin walls. His phone read 11:59. He gripped the flashlight in one hand, his phone in the other. Then it came. Knock. 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 Daniel leapt from the bed, yanking the door open before the last knock had even faded. His flashlight beam sliced through the dark and revealed nothing. Empty porch. Empty woods. But when he lowered the beam, his stomach lurched. There, directly in front of the door, sat a pair of children's shoes. Small. Mud-caked. Facing the cabin door. Daniel's blood ran cold. He bent slowly, as though any sudden movement might summon something from the trees. The shoes were soaked, the mud dark and wet as though they'd just been pulled from a riverbed. But the ground around them was bone dry. No footprints. No sign of anyone placing them there. Daniel backed away into the cabin, leaving the shoes on the porch. He locked the door with shaking hands and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. That night, he barely slept at all, listening for any sound. On the fourth night, the knocking changed. It didn't come from the front door. At midnight, as Daniel sat in bed with every light in the cabin blazing, the first knock sounded directly against his bedroom wall. Knock. 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 His blood turned to ice. The wall was the interior side of the cabin, the one that faced the woods. No porch. No ground to stand on. Just sheer wood planks rising into darkness. But the knocking came again. Louder this time. Insistent. Knock. 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 Daniel stumbled from bed, backing into the opposite wall, phone clutched in his hand. He dialed 911 with trembling fingers, voice cracking as he explained the situation. The dispatcher's calm voice reassured him they'd send someone out, but Daniel already knew no one would find anything. The knocking stopped after a few minutes, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, crouched just beyond the thin wooden walls, listening. Morning light didn't bring relief. When Daniel finally forced himself outside, his stomach dropped. In the dirt leading up to the porch, fresh footprints trailed toward the door. Small. Child-sized. The same muddy residue as the shoes. But what made his blood freeze was where they led after that. From the porch to the door. From the door directly into the cabin. But the door had never opened. And inside, on the wooden floorboards, faint muddy prints tracked across the living room, leading straight to his bedroom door. Daniel stood frozen in the morning sunlight, staring at those small, wet prints. The forest around him was still, but for the first time since arriving, he felt he was being watched. And then a thought slithered through his mind, uninvited and impossible to shake. What if opening the door that night had been the invitation it needed? The knocking didn't come again that night, or the next. But sometimes, when Daniel lay awake in the suffocating silence of the cabin, he swore he could hear it. Faint, from inside the walls. Knock, knock, knock.